The challenge for Boris Johnson, if his government does indeed send over the details that he mentioned there in that speech, is that the European Commission will have to decide whether they're good enough to even continue the conversation. The spokesperson for Jean-Claude Juncker was asked about that earlier. She essentially said, we will consider whatever they send us, but unless essentially it complies with what we've talked about in the past, there's little point in continuing the conversation. What's really interesting about what he's talked about there is the idea that there would be regulatory alignment on both sides of the border, the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. That's been a big concern because of, in particular, the role of farmers in the economy in that region, the difficulties they'll face by suddenly having checks on the border for agricultural products. But what he also wants to try and do is have the Northern Ireland and the UK, the rest of the UK in the long term, out of the European Customs Union. And the idea of doing that 4 years from now, as seems to be the implication, is still going to rely on technology, taking the place of these so-called border checks. And the Commission has made very clear in the last 18 months of negotiations on this point, they are not prepared to see Northern Ireland outside of the European Customs Union without custom checks, because the technology currently does not operate anywhere in the world successfully. What it seems like Boris Johnson and his government's hoping to do is that by giving this 4-year period between the start of the transition and what will essentially be 2022-2023, the Northern Ireland executive, which is currently not essentially operating, would get the say over whether they then do rejoin the rest of the UK in a separate customs arrangement. And during that time, it's essentially an extension of the transition period when it comes to customs checks at least. The UK seems to be hoping for technology to replace the need for those checks. So there's a huge amount of unanswered questions here. The Commission clearly want to see these proposals in writing, in pieces of paper, not like the airy-fairy, to use some of the language of diplomats here, proposals they've seen over the last couple of weeks. They want to see something concrete. They should, in theory, get that this afternoon, and then it will be very interesting over the coming days to see how Michel Barnier and Jean-Claude Juncker, the European Commission President, react to that proposal, whether they then continue these conversations. And we do know that Jean-Claude Juncker will be talking to Boris Johnson this afternoon. His spokesperson said that was essentially a coincidence. They've been trying to arrange a call over this period, and it just so happens it will be a few hours after that speech we just heard from Boris Johnson. Juliana.